Hello again, friends, and welcome back. You join us again as we're working through the series of short studies I've called 66 Books. 66 short podcasts that consider an overview of the 66 books of our Bible. And today we're looking at the book of 1 Thessalonians, the book of Sanctification. First Thessalonians is probably one of the most gentle and affectionate of Paul's letters. It is characterized by simplicity, gentleness, and affection. First Thessalonians itself, in its opening verse, says the authors were Paul, Silas, and Timothy, but most agree the main author is Paul. He refers to himself throughout the book by name and uses I on several occasions. The book was written to the church at Thessalonica. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 1 states that it was written to that church. On his second missionary journey, Paul entered Europe for the first time when he crossed from Asia Minor to Macedonia, which is the northern part of present-day Greece. The first churches that he established in Europe were in Macedonia, in the cities of Philippi and Thessalonica. Paul wrote his first letter to the inhabitants, the Thessalonians of that city, only a few months after he'd established the church there. Paul's initial work in Thessalonica brought great fruit among the Greeks, but violent opposition from the Jews. When the Jews created a huge public outroar, the city authorities tried to restore peace by getting rid of Paul. They made some of the local Christians deposit an amount of money with them, apparently as a sort of guarantee that Paul would leave the city and not return. When this persecution broke out, Paul and Silas left the city, but 40 miles later they stopped at Berea, and Timothy then joined them there. From there, Paul and Silas and Timothy went on to Athens. Later, Silas and Timothy joined Paul in Athens, and he sent Timothy back again to Thessalonica. Timothy caught up with Paul in Corinth and gave him a good report concerning what was going on back in Thessalonica. It was after this discussion that Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians from Corinth, probably in around AD 51. Paul says he earnestly desired to visit them again, and he was encouraged that the Thessalonians were doing spiritually well. Yet Paul still had some concerns about their faith and their sanctification, and especially their attitude towards love. So there are a few doctrinal questions that Paul wants to address in his letter, including something he'd heard about there being some sort of difficulty in some of their meetings. So the message of 1 Thessalonians is primarily about sanctification, that being that sanctification consists of faith, love, and hope, not just in one's personal life, but also in the community, the church life. 1 Thessalonians follows the format of an ancient letter. It begins with a salutation, followed by a thanksgiving. Now a prayer would next be expected, but instead Paul takes a segue off and defends his ministry before returning to finish his thanksgiving, after which he returns to a discussion of his relationship to them, and then finally he prays for them. In Ephesians he interrupted his prayer, but here he interrupts the thanksgiving part of the letter to address some of the doctrinal issues that have been raised. The subject of that section is a discussion on sanctification. Paul is concerned about their faith, their love, and their hope. And Paul tries to inform them and tell them that sanctification is all about growing in maturity, love, and hope. So the book of 1 Thessalonians has several purposes. The first purpose is to encourage believers in their faith. Jewish unbelievers unfairly had accused Paul of using flattery to cover up his greed, and that his real motive was just personal honor. His failure to return to the city seemed in some way to support their claim, and Paul uses this letter to not only defend himself but to encourage the believers there in their faith. The second purpose of 1 Thessalonians is to encourage them to grow in love. Because of moral problems that are going on in the church that has been pointed out, he also exhorts them to be sanctified and by doing so they might grow in love. The third purpose of 1 Thessalonians is to establish that community in hope. After his departure, some had died, and those remaining wondered what would happen next and had questions about what would happen to the departed at the rapture. Paul writes to establish them, confirm them in the hope and comfort of the coming of the Lord. A fourth purpose of 1 Thessalonians is to enlighten them on some church matters, organizational matters. There were a few minor problems in their assembly, and Paul tells them to respect their elders and minister to one another, and gives them some advice on how to handle their meetings properly. So in summary, Paul wrote to Thessalonians in his first letter to encourage the believers there, to encourage them to be more and more set apart unto the Lord in both their personal and their local assembly life. Sanctification, he teaches, consists of growing to maturity in faith, but always in hope and in love.